Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 31st of October 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Garish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Well, who's driving politics, Mike? Soros put $18 billion into
Open Society Foundation.
Open Society.
That's right, but Open Society Foundation funded NGOs are squealing a little bit in Hungary anyway. They are complaining because of Viktor Orban's shutdown on them, or at least clampdown on them. Orban, as you can see on screen, said that the Soros network has an extensive sphere of influence within the European Parliament and other EU bodies, and its aim is to build a Europe of mixed population and to condemn the Hungarian government for opposing their view on migration. He's using the migration issue as the driver for this, but the fact is that the NGOs themselves are complaining bitterly about it. Number of quotes over the mainstream press. One here from Marta Pardavi, who's co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee advocacy group. She said, this way of portraying NGOs, human rights groups and individual activists, basically anyone not aligned with the ruling party, is as paid agents and national security risks, says a great deal about the seriousness of Hungary's undemocratic turn. Am I imagining things, or is that slightly hypocritical? Because is it actually democratic to fund NGOs to go and agitate and drive opinion in countries if you're a so-called philanthropist? Is that democratic?
Well, most people wouldn't think so, Mike, but of course the BBC's charity, BBC Media Action, believes that that's the way to do things, to get in and help destabilise legitimate leader of a country. BBC thinks that's democracy.
The Moscow Times here reporting what's been going on in Russia since Vladimir Putin clamped down on the same types of NGOs in that country. And they're reporting that the number of NGOs operating in Russia has declined from 165 to 89. That's just 0.39% of all NGOs registered in Russia. So this is just the so-called foreign agent NGOs, reduced from 165 to 9. So the policy seems to be working in Russia, Brian. Maybe we should be implementing this policy everywhere.
I think we should. It shouldn't be should we. We should be implementing this policy. We should be getting the foundations, the think tanks, all of these organisations which have got a finger in the pie as to how we live our lives, how politics is run. We should be looking very closely at them, and unless they are squeaky clean, they should be shut down. And of course, I'd have to list Common Purpose as one of the key agents of change in this country,
and globally, increasingly,
and globally,
yeah. And
in my opinion, more dangerous than it was previously due to this global expansion.
Okay, well, let's introduce you to Sirius. This is a new Europol initiative. They're extremely proud of it, apparently. It's there to address the challenge of online investigations. They are going to better support EU member states' investigations on the internet. And so they've launched the Sirius platform yesterday and today. It's a 2-day event. Sirius is, as they describe it, a secure web platform for law enforcement professionals, which will allow them to share knowledge, best practices and expertise in the field of internet-facilitated crime investigations with a special focus on counter-terrorism. But it doesn't end there, Brian, because what they're launching today is a biannual code fest, as they describe it. So basically, they are going to invite certain people to take part in a code fest every 2 years to develop tools for dealing with investigations on the internet. So they're basically going to develop hacking tools, it seems. And they're going to do it out in the open. They're going to bring together law enforcement experts in computer programming to jointly, as they describe it, develop common tools and solutions for dealing with this issue. Who all's involved with this? Well, at the meeting, 100 professionals from 30 countries, more than 60 different organizations, including law enforcement, government authorities in the EU member states, also third-party organizations such as Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Twitter and Uber. So there you go. I'm not quite sure what those companies are going to have to input, but it's clear that increasingly we're seeing law enforcement, intelligence services, and corporations that deal with large quantities of data getting together, and you put this together with what they're describing as a code fest, but might be better described as a hack fest. This looks like a pretty dangerous development.
But surely, Mike, we don't have to worry about it because it's Europol and we're leaving.
And we trust them?
We've got Brexit, so we'll be leaving the European Union.
No.
No, okay. Well, we're going to ask for a little bit of help with this next one. One of our viewers contacted us this morning to say that they'd heard on BBC Two, this was around 9:30 this morning, some discussion about new crimes. And I've paraphrased it a bit here, but this was apparently discussion that there were to be new crimes, and those crimes were to do with effectively criticising the government over its policy, or presumably MPs, or indeed the establishment, so that if your views posted presumably on the internet or elsewhere were considered to be critical or dangerously critical of the government, then this needed to be dealt with. And apparently they were talking some fairly lengthy terms of imprisonment for this. Now, we tried to source this material ourselves. We can't find it, so we're going to ask for help from our viewers and listeners. Did anybody else hear this? Radio 2, we believe it was this morning. But of course, we're seeing this increasingly draconian British government policy to do with anyone who they considers to be, well, what a domestic terrorist, I suppose, Mike.
Knowing the source, I don't doubt the veracity of it, but the question in my mind is, since it only seems to have appeared on one news broadcast, is this, for example, a little bit of nudge unit at work just to see what the public reaction is to something like this?
Yeah. Well, we'll see what our viewers and listeners come up with. But the good news is that the Express, at least, has caught up with the UK column. So this was a headline from over the weekend, which I did enjoy. Revealed shock strategy Brussels will use to lure member states into the EU army. So we're pretty stupid as a nation because we don't really know how to protect ourselves, and we're going to be lured into the EU army. And it's taken a German MEP to get through to the Express. So the German MEP has outlined how the EU will push through its plans to build its own army by encouraging member states to save money by handing over control of military affairs. Well, I think it's right to say that this was exactly as the column revealed some time ago, but we're pleased to see the Express journalists catching up. Well, maybe they're simply watching the UK column, Mike.
Absolutely. Well, sticking with defence issues, here we go. Replacement British soldiers, this time from the 1st Battalion Royal Welsh, have been deployed to Estonia. This is renewing the UK's commitment to NATO allies in Europe, providing reassurance in the face of potential aggression. Who could that be? Who could that be from, I wonder? Potential aggression from Russia, of course, is what they're saying. They're taking over from the 5th Battalion, the Rifles, which has been in Estonia since March. And so this is the Royal Welsh Battle Group arriving there this week. And following an earlier ceremony, yesterday, they're going to lead the multinational Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group, supported by elements from the King's Royal Hussars, the Royal Engineers, the Royal Artillery, as well as soldiers from France and Denmark. So there you go. Here's what Michael Fallon had to say. He said, "Nobody should be in any doubt of our unwavering commitment to the security of Europe through NATO in the face of Russian belligerence." So it's not aggression, it's belligerence today. That's good. In the face of intensifying threats. What intensifying threats are there to Estonia? Are you aware of any? Have we seen any reported in the Times or the Guardian? Because, they're the usual bastions of truth.
No, but usually these things are just sort of brought into the public domain as if there is something to support it.
Well, so he said that in the face of intensifying threats, the UK has stepped up across Europe with soldiers, tanks and typhoons deployed from Estonia to Romania. Our enhanced forward presence is a strategic tripwire that we will maintain on an enduring footing. Language is he speaking?
Newspeak.
Right.
This is Newspeak. dangerous stuff, really, because we think we know what these people are saying, but actually we don't, because we don't know how the language is being used. But if I've got that right, Michael Fallon touching Putin's knee.
Well, that's what I heard on the grapevine. I don't know if it's true.
Well, this is an amazing coincidence, of course, because he's also been apparently touching ladies' knees. So we decided to run with the BBC on this one. Michael Fallon, he's okay. He's apologised for touching a journalist's knee. And radio presenter Julia Hartley-Brewer had recounted the mildly amusing incident without naming Sir Michael, but apparently it's all come out now. This happened back in 2002, so this is a pretty dramatic incident back in 2002, a bit of knee touching. And she wasn't remotely upset or distressed, but she did politely explain to him that if he did it again, she'd punch him in the face.
Right.
So
I can think of many reasons to punch him in the face, but
I don't think I'd like him touching my knee, Mike. That's for sure. But just fascinating that something that took place in 2002, little bit grubby. She says no problem. I threatened to punch him in the face, and we've all moved on. But all of a sudden, this has popped up into
big news on
big
the BBC,
news. Yeah. And this gentleman's also been in the news as well. And we'll get on to him in a minute. But this is Mark Garnier. He's connected, of course, to Brexit. So we're just going to put in a headline here because I'm going to ask a question. These very strange articles, is this to do with the Conservatives trying to actually put a smokescreen around Ted Heath? Is this to undermine the government in the public's eyes? Who is creating the importance of these articles or these reports, and what's the purpose of it? But I suspect from talking to people over recent weeks that many people are now starting to say Westminster's collapsing. So is this part of it?
Could be.
Could be. Okay, well, a little bit of detail on the article about Mr. Garnier, because that always adds a bit of interest. You note that when politicians were commenting on this affair, they made sure that they got their poppy in.
Yes.
So we're talking about a little bit of smut around MPs, but it's important to wear your poppy. So here was the report that Mr. Garnier basically said, sorry, just bring that up on screen. He admitted the claims, but he said he's not going to deny it because I'm not going to be dishonest. I'm going to have to take it on the chin. He apparently called this lady sugar tits. I apologise to our viewers and listeners for using the actual language, but it was part of an amusing conversation about the TV comedy Gavin and Stacey, while the sex toys were brought after a Christmas lunch.
So he went for a Christmas lunch, and then he thought the appropriate thing to do after a Christmas lunch was to go to a sex shop and buy a sex toy, and he sent his secretary in to do the purchasing because he didn't have the guts to do it himself. Is that what the story is?
As always, Mike, you've got right to the heart of that one pretty quickly. I'm just going to, before we go there, I was just going to leave this bit on screen because we've got what's going on here. Westminster is falling apart. These are the people that are running the country. These are the people representing us on a worldwide basis. Or are these the smokescreen stories to help protect the Conservatives over Ted Heath? I don't know. I'm going to keep asking that question. But you got it absolutely right. He said the vibrator shop was hijinks. I hung around outside and she went into the shop. That was it. So what he's really saying is don't blame me. She did it. I just hung around the sex shop like any MP would do.
Was he wearing a raincoat?
I don't know. Probably not, because they got no shame, these people. But let's remember that this is the Brexit without an exit minister.
Yes. Well, is he? For how long? Because they're running away from a sinking ship as quickly as they can. The latest casualty is Baroness Inley. A couple of days ago, she wrote to the Prime Minister and resigned. She said, sorry guys, I'm off. She didn't quite. She said, it is with regret that I write to confirm formally my resignation as Minister of State for exiting the European Union. After 20 years on the front bench, including 4 years as Government Chief Whip and 3 years as a Minister for the Foreign Commonwealth Office and the Department for exiting the EU, it's a great disappointment that a worsening of an injury sustained in 2015 has forced my decision. So she's blaming an injury, and I'm sorry if she's been hurt in 2015. So what was the cause of that injury? Well, she was flying off to Bosnia and Herzegovina in a US military helicopter. And as she was getting out of that helicopter, she expected to find a ladder. And unfortunately, the ladder wasn't there. So she fell out of the helicopter. And this happened in 2015. But the injury has worsened apparently since then. So she can no longer do her job as Minister for State for exiting the European Union. She's apparently very proud of what the government has achieved while she's been part of it. And she's very pleased to have been working with all her fantastic colleagues, including David Davis, Robin Walker, Steve Baker, and the team of talented and professional civil servants working in support of Brexit negotiations. But unfortunately, that team of civil servants is being decimated. Bloomberg, not so long ago, had put through a freedom of information request, and they discovered that 142 employees of the Department for Exiting the European Union had already left. And that included some big names, of course, that appeared in the mainstream press: Lord Bridges, James Chapman, Anthony Phillipson, David Jones, people like this. But 140 staff from that department have left already. Then we've got this, because, I was going to say Theresa May there, but I don't believe Theresa May had anything to do with this in particular. But the key point is here that some of the top civil servants from the Department for Exiting the European Union are being brought into a special team within the Cabinet Office. So what's going on? Is David Davis' team being sidelined? Are they creating a parallel institution here within the Cabinet Office, within the control of the Cabinet Office? I think this is very interesting as far as Brexit. Is this because, for example, the issue of European Union military unification is starting to break cover, and they need some pretty serious people within the Cabinet Office to try to keep control of it? I don't know. But what I'm going to say to people is this article went up on the UK Column website yesterday. Brexit, Theresa May's cards are on the table. I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to read that article and, most importantly, to share it as far and wide as you possibly can. And perhaps one of the things you might like to do is actually ask your own MP for comment on the specific allegations made in this article.
Really excellent article, Mike. I've read it several times. I think you've hit the nail right on the head with this. With regard to the Cabinet Office, if you are carrying out what in my mind amounts to treason, and you know that the public are beginning to actually see what you are doing, then you're going to have to be pretty careful in the team that you've got running this Brexit treasonous operation. So circling the wagons, getting rid of people you don't really trust, bringing in the people that you can trust, that would make sense to me. And of course, the other thing we need to remember is that the Cabinet Office has been running the behavioural insights team. It's now outsourced. It's become a public interest company, I think it is, or a social interest company. But the British government boasting of its ability to manipulate people's minds by the use of this applied behavioural psychology. Who's handling that psychology? The Cabinet Office. Would they use it on their own people? Yes, I think they would. So I think this is the wagon circling. And let's come back onto this one. So we've got Mr. Garnier. He's been a naughty boy by hovering outside the sex shop. But let's come back to Ted Heath. Of course, Ted Heath, the man who took us in to the European Union. And we know that at his time, the public were being deceived, public money being used to run propaganda campaigns to convince people that it was only a sort of common market, when in fact it was the first steps towards the supranational state. So Ted Heath, we're seeing the evidence put on the table that there are questions to be asked around children. Nobody's talking about Ted Heath, but I'm going to say, was this man blackmailed to take us into the European Union? So Conservative smokescreen for child abuse going on at the moment. We bring in these minor things, we blow them up. What we're really trying to hide, Ted Heath was the man, in my opinion, was blackmailed over child abuse to get us into the European Union.
Well, the issue of child abuse doesn't begin and end at the House of Commons, of course. One of the big issues that we've been trying to highlight for quite some time now is the issue of unaccompanied migrant children, and particularly what happens to them when they come to this country. But this UN report here is pointing out that there are currently 3,000 unaccompanied migrant children in Greece who are not receiving any proper shelter or care. And of course, what this does, this is pretty obscene, that these children are there not getting the support that they need. And all the UN seems to be able to do about it is to report on it. Why are they not taking action? Doesn't seem like 3,000 children is a particularly huge number. Don't think it would cost too much money in terms of the United Nations budget to do something about that. But no, they want to report on it and stir up emotions, because of course once you've done that, you've got to encourage members of the public to demand a response. And one of the responses that MPs and others in this country want to see done is that as many of these children as possible come to the UK, where many of them end up in the UK care system, and many of them, as we've reported many times before, end up going straight through the care system and into sexual slavery. At least that's the understanding. So, this problem needs to be dealt with. The UN talking about this today. They're also talking about sex crimes used as a weapon, sex used as a weapon of war, Brian. And in both those cases, at no point is there any suggestion by the United Nations that perhaps there shouldn't be the wars in the first place.
Well, no, you don't want to stop the wars, Mike. That stops the money circulating.
Absolutely. Now, cities. Today is World Cities Day, Brian. You'll be pleased to know.
This is where we're heading. If we're worried about the world today, don't worry. In the future, we go over the Rainbow Bridge and into the city-state.
Right. So the United Nations General Assembly designated the 31st of October as World Cities Day through one of its resolutions. Today the theme is, this year, the theme is Better City, Better Life. That's the general theme, but the specific theme for this year is innovative governance. So we're all about innovative governance. Now, as we know, Brian, governance and particularly governance on a global scale is one of the issues that the city's agenda attempts to push as hard as it can. You can find out more about this on the UK Column website if you want to have a look at Martin Edwards' One World Governance series of articles. So they are using this to highlight the important role of urbanization as a source of global development and social inclusion. So that's all good. Well, in parallel with that, or maybe because of it, we have two major reports on British cities today. One from Collier's saying what a great place London is. It's now top, or it has been for quite some time, of their analysis of 50 major European cities. It's increased its lead over Paris, apparently, which is second place. And the director of Colliers said, in the face of negative reports surrounding the UK's political, social, economic and country risk issues, our research demonstrates that the country as a whole remains in a particularly strong position. That's fantastic news. I'm glad to hear it. JLL is another, Sorry. Yes, I know. JLL, for anybody that doesn't know, they describe themselves as a leading professional services firm specializing in real estate and investment management. It's actually a multi-billion-dollar company. And they are also have released research on the issue of cities. And they've decided that London is the best of the world's most established world cities. So London doing very, very well there. It must be something to do with the city of London itself. This is incredible. Go and have a look at the research. You've got to sign up for it, but it's worth having a look at. They are benchmarking the future world of cities. Yeah, this is Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030 right in your face.
Right in your face. And this, of course, is the agenda that Common Purpose is now pushing with a vengeance through its global leadership programs, the move towards the city-states. And a couple of people in our chat room today are pointing out that, of course, if we look very locally, we're now seeing the government push for the amalgamation of local authorities. That's happening across the country. So if you look at the policy unfolding in England and Wales, certainly in England and Wales, what you've got is the grouping up of local authorities to these ever more powerful bodies controlled by ever fewer people. So this is the city-state coming home to roost.
Yes.
Well, if you'd like to do something about this, it's getting out there, meeting, talking to people, spread the word. We put this ad up last week. Today is the first talk of the Matrix series, which are happening locally in the Totnes area. So today we've got the debt matrix, the birth certificate fraud, treasury accounts, banking and the Bradbury pound. And that starts at 7 p.m. at the Royal Seven Stars Hotel, the Plains, Totnes in Devon. So if you can get along, everybody will be pleased to see you. Justin Walker from the British Constitution Group is one of the speakers. But the nice thing about these local talks is that we know we're getting an increasing number of younger people, which is very good news. Well, let's come back to the subject of drugs, sex. I can't give you the rock and roll, Mike, but we can certainly do the drugs and the sex. And what better place to start than one of Britain's ballistic nuclear missile submarines? So here we are, the BBC, very happy, of course, HMS Vigilant, 9 sailors sacked after failing drugs tests. So this is pretty serious stuff for a warship, a normal warship, nuclear submarine. I repeatedly say very dangerous places. You make mistakes, you're not concentrating, people die very quickly. Take that to another level. We've got one of Britain's ballistic nuclear submarines here where we've apparently got drug problems. Not to worry, who's been pointing this out? Well, it's the Defence Secretary, and he's ordered that all UK submarine crews are to be tested for drugs. So that's a good start. Well, let's move on through. Don't forget that this was the same submarine where the captain was having sex with one of the female junior officers. So I think we can see a little bit of a pattern forming here. This is a vessel really out of control. We've got a complete breakdown here of the professional operation of this submarine.
But this is spectacular, and again, this is a ballistic missile submarine.
Yeah.
So this is the last boat that you want to have a breakdown on.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's incredible.
What I find interesting, Mike, and it's a subject which I have talked about quite a lot in the past, is there's a reason for this breakdown. This is discipline being attacked by policy which brought on the mixed manning. So I've tweeted out on this particular subject that this man abused his power in a particularly unpleasant way, but of course the young lady involved, she consented to it. But it was politicians brought all this in. Then we had the roles reversed, so we had the female captain of a warship having sex with one of her male officers. She ends up being dismissed, and I think she's now left the Navy. Where has all this policy come from? Well, it's come from people like Mr. Fallon. But don't forget, Mr. Fallon's okay because he's only a knee toucher, Mike.
Right.
So if he's there on board the submarine, I hope none of the young ladies had their knee close to him at all. So what else can we say? Well, let's just think about what's going on here. And it didn't take us long to just have a little look back through the press and media to see all of the reports that have come to the mainstream press about the Conservative Party and drugs. So the one that we've got on the screen bottom left, a little bit small probably for viewers, corridors of powder, drug scandal at the Houses of Parliament after traces of cocaine were found on toilets across the Palace of Westminster. No action taken there. And what else can we bring in? Well, George Osborne owed Andy Coulson after News of the World editor downplayed sex and drug scandal coverage. So now we've got a mix between the politicians and their advisors and drugs coming in here. Where can we go next? Well, this one's quite interesting. This is another advisor, top advisor to Chancellor George Osborne, filmed smoking crack cocaine in drugs den. Don't worry, these are the people actually creating the policy for the operational training of the military, those submarines.
But just so we understand what's going on here, we've got the people that decide when the button's going to be pushed, and we've got the people with the button that are all having sex with each other and taking drugs at every opportunity.
Yeah,
Excellent.
And I can say it didn't used to be like this, but we've watched the policy come in. Of course, it came in through Labour under Tony Blair in particular. It's continued under Cameron. It's continuing under Theresa May. And I say what's happening is the military are being taken apart, destroyed from the inside. This was a nice little one. Rising politicians' drug death. Tory tip for Westminster stardom. Found dead in bed by his girlfriend following drink and drugs binge. So he was headed for big places, did a little bit of drugs, but not to worry about that, Mike. Not to worry. And this one here, just so that people don't think I'm being too unfair, there's a few of them. Drugs, debauchery in the making of an extraordinary Prime Minister. For years, rumours have dogged him. Now the truth behind the shockingly decadent Oxford days of the gifted Bullingdon boy. And this one says that Ed Miliband's former spin doctor, Tom Baldwin, left, who was notorious for his own cocaine habit during his earlier career as a journalist, has previously told several sources that he'd seen Cameron Wright taking cocaine. So interesting situation that Michael Fallon has picked up on this. I'll just pop Ted Heath into there. We haven't got drugs with Mr. Heath, but if you can do drugs, maybe a few children possible, don't know. And I'm going to remind people where policies come from in the Royal Navy. This was the Ministry of Defence defending itself about the use of common purpose, but saying, well, don't worry, common purpose has not been used by the RAF or the Royal Navy to train officers between 2010 and 2014. Of course, it was before then, but all of a sudden, oh dear, we don't want to go too close to common purpose. And if we just have a look at what the MOD has said, this is a tiny bit of the money that they've spent. So 2002 up to 2007, £308,000 spent on common purpose, but we can't afford to train the engineers and technicians in the Royal Navy themselves. What can we say at this point? Because I find this very difficult, Mike. We're trying to report the news. The reality of what's going on is so utterly bizarre. It's difficult to say it as it is.
It doesn't get any better with the next one.
No, it doesn't. We better move on to the reality of Britain's super fighter, the F-35B stealth bomber, well, fighter really. Britain's new 150 million fighter here is not a waste of money, says the RAF's top test pilot. But he can't tell you why, because that's secret. Now, I'm a little bit cynical about this because there's no way this young man would be allowed to talk freely to the press. But the article is really about the fact that we've got a simulator.
Yes, good.
So
£2 million simulator, apparently.
We got a £2 million simulator. The article almost suggests this is the first simulator we've ever had.
Right.
Okay. So don't worry about the performance of the F-35B because we've now got a simulator.
Does it simulate accurately all the F-35B's problems?
Come on to those in just a moment. So Michael Fallon has said, don't worry about our defence because we will have in the future this aircraft carrier. It may have 14 F-35Bs.
Good. And
we're going to be conquering the world with that. So here's the young man, Andy Edgell. He said it would be utterly nonsensical to not purchase and design and develop the F-35 and have it as our core staple ingredient forming our air power. Purchase, design and develop. So you buy it and
first.
Then you buy it first. Then you realise it doesn't work, so you have to design and develop it.
Right.
Or was that a Freudian slip by this young man?
Don't know.
I don't know. Well, let's bring in this bit. This is from an earlier article where he was pressed on problems and whether they've been rectified so far. He said there are a variety of things that aren't absolutely perfect, but that's what these tests are for. We hope to have everything ironed out by the time we launch from the carrier.
Well, I hope they do as well. I think he's... I mean, clearly there's a bit of oxygen deprivation going on here, Brian.
Or maybe he's got an engine fire behind him or something. This is just remarkable stuff. Well, let's bring in this one. He says, flying the plane is a pleasure and that it's incredibly simple with an enormous amount of thrust. You very quickly realise when flying the F-35 that it's an enjoyable task when you come back to the aircraft carrier, flying the Harrier back to the carrier. Now that was a handful. Now this fascinated me because in my military time, and I did come into contact with the Harrier pilots, I never heard them actually talking about the Harrier being a handful to get on board deck of a carrier. But I did a little bit of looking into Mr. Edgell. Of course, he's RAF, and his experience is flying Harriers in Afghanistan. So I hope somebody will correct me if this is not quite right, but it appears to me that we've got an RAF pilot with virtually no, or maybe none, no experience of landing on board aircraft carriers.
I'm not aware that the F-35 has received approval for landing on aircraft carriers. I know that I'm talking about the F-35B here. I know that other variants have been landed on US aircraft carrier decks, but of course they're quite a lot bigger than the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier deck. I'm not certain that the F-35B has actually been cleared to land on a deck that the size of the Queen Elizabeth, and therefore I'm not clear that he's in a position to say that it's a pleasure to fly it back to the aircraft carrier, because he hasn't done it yet.
He hasn't done it. Now let's think, if you were going to bring in a new aircraft carrier, wouldn't it be a good scheme to keep the old ones going so that you had all the relevant up-to-date training, then you bring in the new aircraft carrier, then you get rid of the old ones?
But if you do that, you would have trained staff and you wouldn't have to rely on the Americans to fill the gap.
This is absolutely correct. But if you were there to destroy Britain's Royal Navy to help EU military unification, you had to cut the force levels of the British armed forces. This would make complete sense. So we have an RAF trained Harrier pilot, very experienced, we can say, operating from a forward operating base in Afghanistan. It appears little or no experience of landing under arduous conditions at sea, but this is the man bringing in the F-35B. So my next point is, could it be that this young man doesn't actually have the experience to comment in any proper way on the performance or failure of the F-35?
Which comes back to your original point. He's not going to be free to speak, so somebody's written this for him.
There's a script written for him.
Yeah.
Well, there we are. This is the state of the nation. We think it's looking increasingly serious. I'll just remind our viewers and listeners again, if anyone else heard this report from, we think, BBC Radio 2 this morning, suggesting that if you criticise the government was lining up to put you in prison, we'd love to hear more details. But that's the state of the UK, end of October 2017. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.